Hello everyone and welcome to this short lecture on the international negotiations on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships based on my experience, interaction and studies and research done during the IMO MEPC meeting, so MEPC 74 and Intersessional Working Group on Greenhouse Gas 5 and 6. So let's start first of all with some sobering facts about this negotiation. And just to put you into context in relation to what is happening at the IMO during these negotiations. Do you know that, first of all, around 80% of the world trade is dependent on international ocean carriage? So this is a non-negligible fact for you to understand and to take into consideration when approaching this type of negotiation. Whatever you're going to do to shipping, which is heavily based on fossil fuel to operate at the moment, is going to impact 80% of the world trade. So you understand that right away that puts a certain caveat on the negotiation and on the leverages that you're going to be able to apply. Second fact, that international ocean carriage contributes for around 3% of greenhouse gas emissions, which puts it in the sixth position as emitter if the total emission from shipping were a state. Okay, so I'll come back in a minute in relation to the rationale why we are discussing these emissions at the IMO and why we are comparing, if you see orange and apples, if you wish, comparing the total emission of ships as if it was a state. I'll give you more explanation about that. However, for now, what is important for you to realize in relation to those two factual statements is that, first of all, the economical impact on any modification in the way the shipping operates will affect 80% of the world economy. And the second statement, what you should see in that is emission from shipping, you could argue, only contributes to 3% of the emissions. So there would be this sort of argument in the background to say that, well, look, whatever shipping is doing, it's not 97% of the greenhouse gas emission, it's 3%. So that basically puts the negotiation right away on a certain level. Now, what I'm going to discuss here during this lecture to try to give you the general context and the various issues that are at stake are the following things. First of all, I'll give you a general presentation of the IMO MEPC negotiations, what is happening there, general introduction, basically. What is the greenhouse gas issue? What are ships' emission? What is the IMO and how this is operating? Second point, what are the second areas and second topic that I will be considering is the technical, non-legal issue in relation to these negotiations. As you might have guessed, I'm a lawyer, so I do tend to struggle a little bit with non-law issue, particularly when they are technical, and that is very much the case for these negotiations, which deal with a lot of non-legal issue or technical issue, extremely technical issues. So I will discuss some of them and try to break them down for you so that you have a good appreciation and understanding for them. Third topic that I will address in this presentation, I will talk about procedural issues in relation to the negotiations. So procedural issues at the IMO are very specific. Each UN body has its own operation and its own operating rules or procedural rules, if you wish. And so the IMO is not different, and the rules of procedure at the IMO are not necessarily conducive or not necessarily very supportive of fast moving forward negotiation to try to reduce greenhouse gas emission reduction. Then I will talk about the legal issues, so I'll feel a bit more comfortable there, although not entirely, because those legal issues, as you will see, are essentially environmental law legal issues, and I'm not an environmental lawyer. However, I will try to clearly identify those issues and explain to them why it is an issue, why Pacific delegations are facing these issues at the IMO, and what we might want to do about it. And lastly, I will try to reach a conclusion for you and try to summarize and synthesize this presentation so as to enable you to basically use that and get the best out of this presentation. So let's start with a classic graph in terms of greenhouse gas emission and greenhouse gas emission reduction. This is a very well-known one. So I'm not too sure whether you can see the mouse moving on this screen. Otherwise, I'll have to do that during the editing. But basically, what you have on this graph is the curve representing the total emission. Okay. This top one is if we don't do anything in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction. So this is the business as usual curve, and this is the worst case scenario in terms of emission reduction. These are the estimation in millions tons of emissions of greenhouse gas, basically. And on this side here is the possible impact on climate change and on temperature increase. Okay, so as you can see, if we go on emitting, and when I say we, is the world, all industry, all state taken into consideration. If we don't do anything about greenhouse gas emission, business as usual, we'll have massive temperature increase. Massive temperature increase will have direct consequences on climate change, will have direct consequences on sea rising, crops, rain, and the habitability of some areas of this planet. So basically, here we are probably, if this is the 1.5 pathway temperature increase, here you can estimate that you will be around 3 to 4 degrees, and this is probably looking at 7 degrees temperature increase. Huge. So your 7 degrees temperature increase will lead to war, famine, catastrophic climate change. This is really the worst case scenario. Below that, this is the delta where you have the greenhouse gas reduction potential using energy efficiency measure. It does achieve some results in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction, but it's not a great deal. This is what we are trying to achieve in terms of minimum IMO greenhouse gas reduction requirements. So this is the concurrent and in line with the IMO initial strategy on greenhouse gas emission reduction. And below that, this is basically the delta to achieve the 1.5 degree pathway. Don't get me wrong, expert says that with the 1.5 degree pathway, we will still suffer some negative consequences, but nothing compared to obviously the 3 or 5 or 7 degrees. Okay. And the last point that I would say commenting this curve is that the sooner we start to curb this emission curve, the better. The later we start to address the issue, the harder it's going to be. So quickly context about the ship emission and the negotiation at the IMO. So I'm sure that by now you all are aware of the link between greenhouse gas and climate change, temperature rising, sea rising, and so on. So there deniers out there. There are scientific evidence on both sides. However, it seems that more and more the science is proving that there is serious climate change and that greenhouse gas emissions are mainly responsible for that. So in order to have a 50% chance of keeping global temperature below 1.5 degree, we really have to act now. If we have a 2 degree Celsius warming, experts say that there will be some social unrest, humanitarian crisis, environmental disaster. With 3 or 4 degrees, some predict food shortage and wars. At the current rate, some predictions are giving 4 to 7% temperature increase by 2050 and 7 degrees, sorry, by 2100. Now, something that I say a lot, particularly to my law students in relation to all these figures. As lawyers, we are not experts in climate change. We are not geologists. We are not biologists. We are not meteorologists. So we can only take these informations for granted, okay, on face value, unfortunately, because we do not have the technical capacity to assess them. They do seem to be very likely. As a negotiator, and particularly as a lawyer, I usually instruct my students to see what they have to defend and what is the interest of their clients. So here, even if this was not correct, or if there was some doubt, as it seems to be the case, at the end of the day, this is a negotiation, this is an international negotiation, and Pacific states have to work out what is in their interest, and that's the bottom line. So, continuing with the introduction on the greenhouse gas issue, the greenhouse gas debate economic background. And so the whole slide here basically refers to the first factual statement that I said before my introduction, and namely the 80%. So, what you have to understand is that we are these days, particularly since the collapse of the communist bloc, we are in mainly a capitalist world economy, highly connected world economy. So in a capitalist world economy, basically the market has to adapt. And the market has to engage into what is appearing in this box here, which is the ecological transition, decarbonization, climate transition. Okay, so the trade and the market economy bores, hates, is very resistant to abrupt changes. So there has to be this transition, and a large part of what's happening at the IMO is really the evidence of that, the path towards a smooth transition to enable the market economy to adapt to the changes. That means that it has to be an incremental processus and a progressive transition. This is the implicit capitalist doctrine and the invisible hand regulation. Okay, let the market self-regulate itself. It will make the best choice and the most profitable choice for everyone. It's a bit of an ideology here, and I'm not saying I embrace this or I reject this. What I'm trying to explain to you is that this is the situation in which we are. We are in a market economy, and because we are in a market economy, the transition has to be progressive. So market self-regulation, progressive transition. The markets have to be confident in what they are doing to avoid an absolute abrupt economic collapse. The worst that can happen basically in the market economy is a state intervention, because the state intervention, you don't let the market regulate, you don't let the market intervene. The state has a policy to put in place, and it's a forceful implementation of that policy. And what we call economic actors have to comply with that, which they usually are very reluctant in doing. If that happens is usually because there has been a huge crisis. I refer you to the 2008 financial crisis. The other element to take into consideration is that as much as we are in a market economy, the world is a market economy at the moment, there is no global governance. So there is no, if you see, if you wish, supranational state dictating, telling everyone we have to do that because this is of paramount importance for our survival. That's not the case. So here we are in the situation where we have a multiplicity of small actors taking these decisions without a cohesion and a consistent approach from the top. So why is that important? That's important because that means there is only, in the market economy that I've just described, there is only 3 ways that the ecological transition, the decarbonization, the climate transition that I've talked above can happen. The first one is market-based measures. So market-based measures, that is your industry itself accepting to regulate emission, accepting to do something about climate change, accepting to do something about greenhouse gas by taxing the emission. That's a classic neoliberal approach. It's a pure, in economic terms, it's a pure negative externality, to use the term of the Miltonian or the economist. Negative externalities, it is a negative produce external to an economic activity, and that will impact the market. And so that needs to be addressed because it's negative. And the classic way to address that is by imposing a tax because you're doing something that is actually impacting negatively the whole system. The second possibility is technological innovation, product or process substitution. So here you're trying to tackle the greenhouse gas emission issue, not by taxing the emissions so that they will reduce, but by creating an incentive for technological innovation and substitution of technologies that are producing a lot of greenhouse gas by technologies that are not producing much. Okay, but obviously, as you can imagine, that requires and that demands that the technology is there and can be implemented at a similar cost because we are in a market economy. Okay, and the third possibility is directly the financial leverage, if you wish, directing the role of stock exchange. So basically, where the stock exchange, the finance world, will invest in technologies that are not greenhouse gas emitters, and they will remove investment from technologies that are emitting a lot. Now, let's consider very quickly the problem with those 3 ones and the limitations of those 3 leverage that are the classic way that a market economy, a neoliberal system can operate with. First of all, market-based measures, emission tax levy and so on. You have to agree on this. And in a very competitive world, that will create some issues and some time before you can achieve such measures, particularly when you do not have, as I've explained earlier and as it appears on the box here, no global governance. Okay, so everyone will have to sit at the table and agree. And this is largely what we are trying to achieve at the IMO. This is the leverage that is clearly on the table at the IMO. Technological innovation, well, this is another leverage that is more or less at the IMO, but the IMO doesn't have really any funds to invest and direct towards technological innovation. It can put some regulatory requirements on the floor saying, well, we would like to privilege this type of measure, but that creates all sorts of tension and is very contentious. The third one is obviously not part of the IMO negotiations because it's something that is in the hand of the finance world and not at the disposal of the IMO. I'll stop here because of the size of the recording, and we'll continue in the second part. Hello again, back to this general presentation on the greenhouse gas emission reduction negotiations at the IMO. So I'm coming back to this table and starting from this table, and where I've basically explained to you what are the three possible leverage that exist in the market economy, neoliberal, classic neoliberal situation. So if we now go into a bit more detail and consider each possibility. So let's look at the market-based measure, emission tax, levy, and so on. The problem with those is what's going to happen. So let's suppose that we all come together, we at the IMO, we all agree that there should be some tax on greenhouse gas emissions and some levies, and shipping should really cut their emissions. Whatever measure you decide to apply there are going to have some consequence on your economies because we are in the market economy. And the problem with this is that it's going to disproportionately affect the poor systematically. Because if you put a tax, clearly the people that are very wealthy will be able to afford this additional tax without much problem, whereas the poor might all of a sudden fall into the situation where they no longer are able to afford the service of shipping, because all of a sudden shipping is becoming way more expensive than they can afford. So in summary, any market-based measures in abstracto, just to start with, will have the direct effect to disproportionately affect the poor, disproportionate impact on the poor. So if you decide to go down the road of the market-based measures, and you represent a country that you know is not very wealthy, clearly you have to be very much aware of this consequence, and you have to think about some form of compensation or adaptation scheme to try to show, to try to cater for this impact. The problem then becomes your responsibility to try to demonstrate how adversely you've been affected. Because if you want to put in place a compensation scheme, you're going to have to show how much you've been affected with. Now, in relation to the Pacific, this is going to be a very difficult task because we do not have very clear data on the fleets that are operating in the Pacific. We do not know even what is the cost of the fuel that they're buying, what is the consumption. So you're not going to be able to put a good case to the IMO if you do not have this data, and if you're not able to show how much your economies are going to be impacted. and this is not pure speculation here, because this is exactly where we are at the moment with the negotiation at the IMO. We went through the establishment of a procedure for impact assessment, and this is not your usual impact assessment where we assess the impact of an activity on the environment. No, at the IMO we are talking, when we're talking about impact, we are talking about impact of a measure to reduce greenhouse gas emission from ship, and the impact that this measure might have on the economy of states. So it's the other way around as the normal impact assessment procedures elsewhere. So you're going to have to be able to be in the position to go to the IMO showing how much impact you might be incurring as a result of any potential measure to reduce greenhouse gas. Second, 80% of the CO2 emissions are not taxed, and 50% are taxed at less than $10 per ton. Now, this is taking into consideration any form of CO2 emission, greenhouse gas emission, regardless of the origin. So 80% of the greenhouse gas emission, land-based, shipping-based, air-based, and so on, are not taxed. And 50% are taxed, but at less than 10% a ton. Now, expert, I think, says that to really have an impact on emission, you at least need to reach the $50 to $100 per ton. So we're really, really far from any relevant measure in terms of curbing the greenhouse gas emission. Last point in relation to this, bunker fuel used for shipping is actually not taxed. Why? Because, and there is a very logical and rational argument used by shipping lines saying that we cannot pay tax in a country for the fuel that we purchase there because we are not using that fuel in that country. Therefore, you cannot apply the taxation system and levy of your country to this product because it's not used in your country. It's quite straightforward. Last point about market-based measure, experts consider that carbon price should be around $40 to $80 in 2020 to have any impact, and $50 to $100 in 2030 to have any impact. Really far from that at the moment. So where are we at in relation to market-based measures if this is not handled properly? We might have social unrest. Why? Because if these measures are not associated with a compensation scheme or adaptation scheme for the poor country, then the poor countries and poor people will be affected mostly. Capitalism seems to be completely unable to transition and adapt to the emission challenges, and that, if you ask my humble opinion from the experience that I've had at the IMO, that seems to be very much the case. Continuing on, the second possible leverage, which is the technological innovation, product and process substitution. Various technology to consider. LNG emits greenhouse gas. It's probably less polluting because there is less heavy particles and so on than bunker fuel. I will give you that much, but LNG is still a greenhouse gas. The shipping industry, if my understanding is correct, is trying to sort of push towards this solution because it is, yes, slightly better for the environment, but more than anything else, it is easier for them to adapt to that, to transition. Therefore, back to the initial concept that I've presented to you earlier on. Hydrogen seems to be a great technology. It's probably close to be ready. And the problem with hydrogen is that to be viable as a greenhouse gas emission alternative, you have to be able to be in a position to produce what we call greenhouse gas and not gray. In other words, you have to produce hydrogen, which is very energy intensive, from a source that does not produce itself greenhouse gas. So, in other words, not from fossil fuel. Yet, my understanding is that 70 or 80% of the hydrogen that is currently produced in the world is produced based on fossil fuel. You can produce hydrogen from solar energy or from geothermy and so on, and that would be probably ideal a source of energy to use in production of hydrogen in the Pacific. But at the moment, it's not really the main source. And obviously, you will have to change completely your infrastructure. So in terms of production, supply, storage, and so on. There are some good news. It seems that hydrogen in some cases could be transitioned and could be used in diesel engine, which is also an issue. You know, you can use hydrogen in either fuel cells to produce electricity, and then you have to change the source of power at the shaft of the ship. But if you were able to use hydrogen in the diesel engine, then you would be able to keep your diesel engine there and run it in a green way, so to say. You could have entirely green technology shipping specific here, such as the Flettner rotor, kites or seaplanes. We leave probably Dr. Peter Nuttall, to give more explanations about this technology. They are sort of ready. They've been transitioned onto some vessels. There've been some sea trials and so on. Some of them offer very promising results, but we are still a long way to have an economy of scale, to have those technology widely adopted across the board, even where they would make more sense, for instance, in the Pacific. We have ammonium also as an alternative. My understanding is that, again, I'm not an expert, but if you burn ammonium one way or the other, and again, it seems that you can burn ammonium in the diesel engine, that would not release greenhouse gas. I'm not too sure what that would release. You would still have to modify a fair amount of your infrastructure, existing infrastructure, which is fossil fuel based, because ammonium as a gas is very corrosive. So you would have to change all your pipes, storage, and so on. And that creates some risk and liability, obviously, for ship owner. And in addition to that, ammonium in gas or in storage, if there is a maritime catastrophe, ammonium plus water, I believe, makes citric acid. So you would have another environmental catastrophe on your arms. So it seems that here, as far as the technological innovation is concerned, there is not a ready solution for substitution just yet. And when I'm talking about a solution ready for substitution, it's obviously considering the cost and the feasibility of the progressive transfer or adaptation. Let's consider the third option, which is the directing role of the stock exchange. And again, here we do not have great news. Why? And so if I can just reframe the debate here, when I talk about directing role of the stock exchange, I'm talking about financing or diverting investment towards technology, towards assets that are not greenhouse gas emitters. That implicitly and immediately means that the finance world would retire investment from assets that do produce greenhouse gas emissions. And let me break that down to you very specifically. If the finance world is engaging or is asked to retire or withdraw investment from greenhouse gas emitting technology, it means that all the assets in which they have invested for this past 10, 20, or 30 years are now, if you wish, disqualified. They become, I believe, in technical terminology, financial technology, retiring assets. It is an asset that no longer will produce return on investment. So all of a sudden, you're asking the finance world that has invested in a technology or in an asset, sorry, not in technology, but in an asset that the finance world has on his balance sheet there for the next 30 years, and all of a sudden you're saying, no, not 30 years. If you haven't made your profit in 5 years, it's too bad. You have to retire this asset. So you're putting something that had 30 years of production or return on investment plan into a 5 years return on investment. So you're looking at losing 25 years of return on investment. That's a huge loss for the financial world. That's basically them putting into rubbish 90% of the investment that they made there. for aircraft or a ship of certain size. You're telling them, you take this ship and you put it to scraps. You're losing 90% of your investment. And by losing, I'm very adamant about this word here. You put 100 million there, you've lost 90 million. That's it. Needless to say that the finance world is not going to be too happy about that. So retirement asset will lead to massive shock on stock capitalization. It will lead to collapse. It will impact on investment funds, hedge funds, superannuation funds, because these are the people that have the money to invest. And the question therefore becomes right away, can the stock exchange investment replace the retirement loss asset? Unfortunately, not very likely. And the answer for you here is quite hypocritical. It's quite cynical, if you wish. Historically, when a massive investment effort is required in a short time frame with a return on investment in a very long term, so picture that very clearly here, massive investment required in a very short frame, and the return on investment is long term, only states can act, not the market. So in other words, here, the third solution, which is asking the financial world to step in, the answer is no way. No way in the market economy, this cannot work. If you are facing this type of situation, the only one that will be able to face it will be states. Okay, I've read a little bit of the literature, not much, but and what I've read confirm the situation, namely that the finance world is not interested in even commencing to contemplate this. So it will have to be state. What I've read though, which is very interesting, is that if I understood, the stock exchange of London, New York, and so on are basically waiting for China to step in. And China to say, okay, we are going to divert 50%, 100% of our financial investment into greenhouse gas non-emitting assets. I just want probably to have a note of caution here, because if China does that, yeah, they would buy the bullet, but it's not going to come free later on. You know, if they have the investment into these assets, they will make someone pay ultimately for it. Now, so this was basically the general economic background to these negotiations with the three possible leverage for action. A quick table here, as I said, I've mentioned that to you, but I'm just going to dwell a little bit more on that. This table on this chart shows you the emitters, the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas. We have China, which is a recent great producer of greenhouse gas. You have more traditional greenhouse gas emitters, such as the US. India is also a recent one. Russia is a traditional greenhouse gas emitters. Japan is also a fairly traditional one. Now we have a boat there in sixth position, and that's what I was saying to you earlier. If shipping, the total shipping and shipping emissions were taken into consideration as if it was a state, it would be ranked in the sixth position. So yes, it's only 3%, but if we start to rank the global emission from shipping as a country, it appears in the sixth position. But yes, the argument is that, but hang on, this is not a country, this is the contribution from trade between various countries. Yes, it's true. The concerning part is, and I don't know if you see my mouse, is the evolution of greenhouse gas emission from shipping, and it's not slowing down. It will go up and up and up because it's expanding exponentially at the moment. Other point that you must know engaging into these negotiation on greenhouse gas emission reduction from ships is that at the moment, and there's been some modification in relation to that, but at the moment, ships are using bunker fuel. Bunker fuel produce a lot of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, particulate matters, volatile organic compounds, ozone depleting substance. So there is a lot of nasty things. And the reason for this is that bunker fuel is really the cheapest fuel that you can find on the market. And this is why the shipping has shown some interest in that, because they could store vast quantity of it on board of their boat, and they wanted a cheap fuel for their boat. So bunker fuel is basically what remains after crude oil has been refined into your super, your ether, your all your fossil fuel produced. Even after the production of diesel, what remains there just before the production of asphalt is your bunker fuel. And this is why it's the heavy stuff that remains at the bottom of everything. Now, another important element for you to consider is that this is the table that was created and released by the EPA, the US Environmental Protection Agency, in 2009, when Obama was still president of the US, and when the US had still some sort of positive intention in relation to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This is the type of impact that on North America only, that typical burning of bunker fuel has on the coastal population. So I'll leave you to contemplate this table yourself, but as you can see, this is directly related to the burning of bunker fuel from ships. Last bit of context background, the main feature of the shipping industry in a nutshell. You also have to take into consideration, so therefore, that yes, it's using bunker fuel, very bad quality fuel. It's a very efficient, however, and very economical way to carry cargo. It's probably the per ton of cargo carried is probably the least emitters of greenhouse gas. If you compare, for instance, the amount of greenhouse gas emission from ships and per ton, and the greenhouse gas emission of trucks, the trucking industry or the railway industry per ton of cargo carried. Again, I said 70 to 80% of the world trade is carried by ship, and it is the key to globalization. So if shipping stops, the world stops, liberal market economy stops, and there is right away war and shortage of food, shortage of medicine, shortage of pretty much a lot of basic things, including in the Pacific, where a lot of your most basic food, I'm thinking about, for instance, rice and sunrise. If shipping has to stop, you will not get rice to feed your population. So this is something that is worth considering very carefully. Last thing, the shipping world is a world where normally on some routes you have a very high competition, and on other routes not at all. And unfortunately for the Pacific, this is where the competition, you have the least amount of competition on your trading routes, which explains why your freight rates is to the roof compared to routes where there is a lot of competition. You also, in relation to the shipping world, you also have a fair bit of competition between registries. And that's the phenomenon of flag of convenience. And why am I mentioning this here? I'm mentioning this here because clearly that plays in the background of the negotiations on greenhouse gas emissions at the IMO, because at the IMO, even though you have this sort of fiction that at the IMO it's an international organization, so therefore countries are sitting there, in fact, very often at the IMO, because of the shipping industry, because of the nature of the operation of the ship registry and the existence of flag of convenience, very often behind states, it is the ship registries that are pulling the ropes. Last bit of information in relation to the introduction. Sorry, why has the IMO been given the tax of dealing with the reduction of greenhouse gas emission? Precisely because countries consider that these emissions cannot be attached to one country in particular. Therefore, they could not be dealt under the UNFCCC, which is the international organization dealing with greenhouse gas emission. And this is why the IMO, which is the UN body dealing with shipping, has been tasked with it. What is the IMO? So it's the International Maritime Organization, and how does it operate? It operates, as I've pointed out to you earlier, by diplomatic relations, but sometimes or very often some of the key players for some delegations are actually the ship registry because of the phenomenon of open registries. International shipping has to reduce emissions as soon as possible and reach zero emission by 2040. That's the initial IMO strategy. Pacific leaders have consistently instructed their government to do so, and as they can, to meet the Paris Agreement temperature goals. Okay, but again, here you have conflicting interests sometimes between the states and the shipping industry, and particularly when you have an open registry. How did I become involved in these negotiations as part of the technical support to the Pacific delegations? I come from the shipping world, but not with an environmental law background, just with the shipping law background. So very often I found myself in a very uncomfortable position because the negotiations are highly technical, shipping technical, and when they are not purely shipping technicals, they are dealing with environmental law concepts, which I'm also not entirely familiar with, but I'm start to be cognizant of. The posture adopted in relation to the negotiations occurring in relation to climate change and the position of negotiator, again, those negotiations are sometimes or very often highly technical, and the important is to try to secure the best deal for the Pacific Islands and for your countries. And this is what I wanted to say here. I'm going to have to stop here because the lecture is getting long. Welcome back to part 3 of this small lecture on the greenhouse gas emission reduction from ship, greenhouse gas emission from ship. We are continuing with the general introduction. So, as you might be aware, Pacific countries have been really at the forefront of these negotiations, trying to achieve high level of emission reduction. And this has been a very challenging task, particularly given the rules in place at the IMO, which is the international organization that has been tasked with this emission reduction because of its regulatory nature of the shipping industry. So very quickly, this is the very simple chart of the IMO structure. You will see the various committee that the IMO has, and obviously the relevant one, the most relevant one for these negotiations is the MEPC, Marine Environmental Protection Committee. So let's turn now to the technical issues that Pacific Island delegations have had to face at the IMO when engaging in these negotiations. So first of all, I would say Pacific delegations have faced 3 technical issues. First one, the issue about technical issue about fuels, try to grasp, what is the advantage, what is the interest of Pacific Island states in relation to those possible future fuel, try to weigh in these negotiations, because we can clearly foresee that whatever choice will be made, then you will have to adapt and you will have to follow a trend because of the economy of scale. We will have to uh, adopt the system that has been adopted elsewhere. And so now it's the time of negotiation. So now it's the time to be really informed and try to weigh in this debate. But it's not easy because that will have some consequences in relation to production, infrastructure, and distribution. And some fuels might be very difficult for Pacific Island countries to produce, store, distribute, and so on. Second, technical issues, and this issue was sort of substantially discussed, particularly at the last intersessional working group, speed limitation. Um, Whatever you do, as I've explained earlier in the introduction to this lecture, whatever you do will have some impact on your economy. Okay, so the idea is to try to find a solution that will least impact Pacific Island countries and will provide the best solutions in terms of emission reduction. This is not a simple solution because obviously the interests that are represented around the table are not only the interests of Pacific Island countries. You've got an interest of all the other nations, and they have substantially different interests, particularly when you take into consideration that some countries are producers of fossil fuel and they do not necessarily want to cut the usage of this source of energy. So if you start to adopt a speed limitation, there was various possible solutions discussed there, a goal-based one or an absolute speed reduction. Absolute speed reduction would consist in simply putting a cap on the speed of ships, and that would have a direct and directly measurable effect on emission reduction. The faster a go ship, the more it emits. The slower it goes, obviously, the lower it emits, and this is exponential. Okay, that's the important part. If you take into consideration the ships that are serving your routes in the Pacific, it's very likely that they are already quite slow. Difficult to measure again because complete lack of data. The IMO is also looking at reducing the emissions through better design of ships, energy efficiency of operation, so better operation of ships, not only design but also better operation of ships, and ships energy efficiency management plan, and so on. So I'm not going to get into details in relation to all these factors. They are highly technical. I'm not even sure that I could really, or I'm very much on top of those discussions. But what I want to alert you to in relation to all this is that this is not something that necessarily Pacific Island countries are able to engage with, because your fleets are not necessarily modern fleets. You know, they are probably do not have a best energy efficiency design intakes. In fact, the regulations in relation to EEDI might not even apply to your vessels because they are too old for that, and they're already going slow, as I explained earlier. So that's probably one of the most frustrating part, is that all the negotiations taking place at the IMO in relation to all this are not really relevant for most of the ships servicing your country. They might be very relevant, however, if you have an open registry and you have what we call offshore shipping. Because it's very likely that the ships registered under your offshore shipping registry will have to comply with all this, and so therefore you will be impacted if measures are implemented there, because if your country ratified those more stringent rules and another ship registry doesn't ratify them, then you might have sort of a transfer of ships that would be registered under your ship registry to the benefit of another ship registry. So that this is something that flag of convenience are and open registries are very much aware of. but that's the nature of competition at the IMO. So this is just a quick chart to show you the exponential effect of speed emission in relation to emissions of greenhouse gas in relation to speed. That was the example of a container ship. Second categories of issues that Pacific Island countries have faced at the IMO, and they are namely procedural issues. So by procedural issues, I usually refer to, first of all, IMO rules in relation to the attendance of delegations to IMO negotiations. And that has been really itchy point in the Pacific Island country representation at the IMO, because we have been lucky enough for a number of meetings recently to have funding from the European Union to attend those meetings. But this funding, my understanding is that it's about to stop, and that will mean the end of Pacific Island countries' representation at the IMO in relation to the negotiations on reduction of greenhouse gas. There is also procedural issues in relation to the working arrangement, and there was a lot of questions about the creation of the dedicated MEPC subcommittee or the continuation with an intersessional working group. Why is that relevant? It's relevant because one solution or the others has cost implications for delegations, cost implications for the IMO, implications in terms of the work that will be produced by the IMO, because if a subcommittee, dedicated subcommittee is created, that means that you will have dedicated translators working, and translators have normal office hours, so that might slow down in some cases the work produced by the IMO, because everything will have to be translated up to the maximum working hours of translators. Some documents will be available only the next day because translators have to work on that. And that means that the work of a subcommittee might be by nature slower than the work of an intersessional working group where everything is in English. A third point in relation to procedural issues, the impact of the assessment procedure. As I pointed out to you earlier on, it's not your usual impact assessment procedure, and certainly not an environmental impact assessment procedure. It is the other way around. The impact assessment procedure at the IMO and the procedure that we have agreed on in the past meetings at the IMO and the past that was consecrated by the last MEPC 74 is about measuring the impact, economical impact on the economy of states of the greenhouse gas emission reduction measures that might be adopted by the IMO. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I've also pointed out here the issue about national action plan. China has had is a strong proponent of the measures of a national action plan. There are some procedural issues about that. I will not dwell too much on that, but there is some procedural issues in relation to that. And last but not least, legal issues. So I've got 10 minutes to work on that and try to introduce you to those legal issues. So what are they? 4 central legal issues in relation to these negotiations at the IMO on the reduction of greenhouse gas emission from ships. The first issue is the issue of incompatibility between the requirement of science-based measure. So the IMO has this principle of science-based measure. At least the IMO believes that it has this principle. However, this principle doesn't appear as such as a principle in any of the IMO funding documents that I found. So it doesn't appear as such as a principle in the IMO convention itself. It might appear into some subsequent work that the IMO did, but it doesn't constitute the Bible or the rule or the regulation on how the IMO is supposed to operate. However, there is this belief or this sort of implicit, tacit agreement that whatever the IMO decide, it should be based on science, okay, and not ideology. The problem is that these science-based measures, therefore, as I pointed out, do not come from the IMO. It actually come, and I can track the origin of this principle. It comes from the WTO trade, okay, World Trade Organization, where every measures trying to limit or trying to create a trade barrier have to be science-based. Okay, there has to be a really good scientific reasons for a trade barrier. Now, this science-based measure principle is completely contrary to the principle of precaution, which is and this time we are talking about a real principle, and it's a principle of environmental law, and it's a principle that is widely accepted. So some countries still criticize that, still argue that it's not a principle, and it's actually true legally. It's not entirely a principle, but it tends to be more and more so. For instance, the US are opposed to the emergence of this principle of precaution. I'm not going to dwell again on the environmental law. There's various layers of crystallization of the principle of precaution if you want. The Paris Agreement, though, has engaged in a solid step forward towards the emergence of such a principle of precaution. Quickly, what is the principle of precaution? The principle of precaution means that when there is an activity that is likely, it's not certain, but is likely to create an environmental damage or have an environmental impact, then there should be whoever is engaged into that activity should restrain from engaging into it. Okay, so in other words, in legal terms, if you want, lawyers talk about a burden of proof. And so here with the principle of precaution, what that principle does is it shifts the principle of precaution. In normal times, without the principle of precaution, if you want a science-based measure approach, basically it means that if you think that an activity is dangerous, or if someone is saying to you an activity is dangerous for the environment, that person will have to prove that the activity is dangerous and so that it should be stopped. With the principle of precaution, the burden of proof is shifting the other way around. It is the person that wants to continue engaging into the activity that might be dangerous for the environment that has the burden of proving that there is no such a risk. So I hope that makes sense to you. So as you can see, science-based measure versus principle of precaution, completely antinomic, completely opposed. Yet the IMO is trying to compromise those two, saying that on the one hand, its operational rules are science-based. They have to be, any measure that they adopt have to be science-based, but they take into consideration the growing importance of the principle of precaution as it emanates from UNFCCC. How they can conciliate those two principles, I don't know, and clearly it doesn't appear very clearly during the negotiations, and each time that there would be room for discussion of the principle of precautions, the IMO seems to be willing to bury the discussion. Second principle that I wanted to talk to you about here in relation to legal principles is the issue of incompatibility between the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, also called CBDR, which is actually almost a principle of customary international law and a principle of equity, international equity, and the principle of no more favorable treatment, which is a principle, again, that the IMO seems to have adopted by convention. And when I say by convention, it's just tacitly. There is no formal acceptation or justification or endorsement legally of the no more favorable treatment at the IMO. Again, I can track down this no more favorable treatment origin to the WTO, which is the clause under the WTO treaty. It exists under the form of the most favorable treatment clause. So basically, every country, once it signs the WTO agreement and the GATT agreement, should provide any other country the most favorable treatment in terms of trade barrier that it provides to the country that it has the best trade relation with. So what this means here in relation to the IMO, it means that on the one hand, you have the principle of no more favorable treatment. Every country should be treated the same, absolute equality. On the other hand, you have the CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility, which consists in saying, yes, okay, we have the common responsibility, but we haven't contributed, every country hasn't contributed to the same extent to this environmental crisis that we are all facing. And therefore, some countries should have a differentiated responsibility and should be put in a different situation when it comes now to the situation whereby countries have to face, repair, and face the challenge of adapting. So the costs should be majorly reported to the country that are mostly responsible for that. So I hope you see that how those two principles, the CBDR and the no more favorable treatment, are going to collide. One is saying absolute equality, no more favorable treatment. We are all going to contribute to the same amount, and we are all going to take charge at the same level. The other principle is saying no, some countries we're going to have to contribute more than others. How is going to the IMO is going to deal with that? I am not too sure, but this is definitely a clash. Last point that I wanted to talk about the legal issues. We have the issue of market-based measure, financial solution, and as I've identified earlier on, this will have drastic impact on poor countries, and so that will require for adaptive or compensatory scheme. How are you going to put that in place? I don't know. Last thing, whatever measure you can come up with in relation to greenhouse gas reduction, you're going to have to make sure that obviously the shipping industry is going to follow them. And that will require some policy, some enforcement measures. Who is going to enforce that? Port state, flag state, where, on which, in which area, in port, in territorial sea, on the EEZ, on the high seas. This will create direct, immediate legal issues. Synthesis of all this, so very briefly. I have tried to create this table, and I'm not too sure to which extent the table or the synthesis that I've tried to come up with is correct. But I've tried to analyze the situation in the following way, and this is really coming from my analysis, my perception of the negotiation at the IMO. On the one hand, we have the objective one, which is emission of reduction. Okay, this is what we are trying to achieve at the IMO here. As a delegation or as a group of delegation, we really want the shipping world to reduce its emission. At the same time, we know that there are only three possible leverage for a market economy to address this greenhouse gas emission issue. And one of the way it can do it is the market-based measure that we've discussed, or that I've shown, or the technological advancement, and this will have financial impact. And therefore, the objective two is to try to reduce the impact, financial impact or economical impact that these measures to reduce emission might have on your state economy. These two, I believe, are contradictory or opposed. You will necessarily, obligatorily have tensions between those two. Because if you're trying to create some incentive or some waivers to try to alleviate or reduce the financial implications of the measures to reduce emissions, that will lower down the ambition on emissions, or that will increase the emissions if you want. So this is why I've created this table with two columns. Measures that will have essentially for objective to reduce the emission, and measures that will have essentially the objective of protecting states' economy. So the objective 1 is increased emission reduction. Obviously, objective 2 is increased financial impact cost, so increased financial, not impact, reduction of impact cost of those measures. So I should probably rephrase that. And then you have the different principles that I've discussed above, namely principle of precaution. Clearly, this one is on the side of emission reduction. And then you've got on the other side of the spectrum, science-based and no more favorable treatment. And the CBDR is basically in the middle, because the CBDR says, we need to have measures that will reduce the emission, but not everyone is going to pay for those. So it depends on where you are, basically. But for Pacific states, clearly, it is both we want emission reduction and we want those CBDRs measures. We want to be treated differently from those countries that have massively contributed to the situation in which we are now in. So I've ranked in the objective emission reduction, the short-term measures, a mandatory operation speed limitation, because that is the most effective measures in cutting emission. Reduce the speed of ships clearly will have a direct positive impact on emission reduction. On the other hand, you have other measures, short-term measures that are goal-based, and those measures are more in line with the objective of reducing the impact, financial impact of the reduction of greenhouse gas emission measures. I have ranked here and I've explained to you why these short-term measures that I've ranked there as the mandatory technical goal-based measures will raise some issues. In addition to that, we have also a series of mid-long-term measures, alternative fuels and so on, and why these ones could be closer to achieving emission reduction, but they also represent a very big challenge in relation to financial impact. So this was my attempt to synthesize, if you wish, these negotiations. Last bit, and my conclusion, a plethora of issues that make negotiation of reduction greenhouse gas emission reduction a real challenge, particularly for Pacific Island countries. And so from an observer point of view, someone that has taken part of only 2 rounds of negotiations, the way the IMO is approaching those measures really begs the questions, as far as I'm concerned, whether the exact content of the mandate of the IMO is to protect the shipping industry or really to protect the ocean. And if you read the IMO convention, it should be to protect the ocean, to protect the environment. So that is probably something to review. I'm talking about the IMO mandate here, because if they're not delivering on their mandate, there could probably be a room for challenging that. Last bit, and that's the conclusion, that's an image. When we are united, when the Pacific countries are united, this is the picture that was taken during a break, whereby some of the main delegations, so you can see here the US, New Zealand, the EU, and so on, but you can also see various Pacific states, and at the center here there is the coordinator for the Pacific states negotiation teams here at the center, and all these other states knew that they needed the Pacific on board. So the message really to retain from this is that we are stronger when we are united, and we need to be in the negotiation room to have a weight, but that's obviously a pleonasm or an obvious statement. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this presentation was useful to you all.